What if I told you that the sugar in your morning tea was once paid for with drugs? Not metaphorically, literally. Every spoonful of sweetness that touched a British tongue in the 1800s was balanced somewhere in the books of the empire by a shipment of opium. Imagine that for a second. Your sugar cube, neat, white, innocent, hides a dark transaction. Indian fields, Chinese harbours, and British ledgers inked in addiction. And by the end of this video, you'll see how one of the most civilized economies in history was secretly built on the world's most profitable drug trade. The story begins not in a battlefield, but in a teacup. In the 19th century, tea wasn't just a drink, it was national identity. And with it came sugar. The British drank oceans of it. Sweetness became a daily right, a comfort, a class symbol. But there was a problem, a massive one. Britain loved to buy tea and sugar, but it had almost nothing China wanted in return. Silver was the only acceptable payment, and silver, back then, was bleeding out of London faster than ships could bring it in. An empire that ruled the seas was quietly running out of coins. So what do you do when you're losing money on every sweet sip? You find a new currency, one that doesn't just move markets, it rewires minds. Opium. Picture the triangle. India, under British control, grew opium poppies. Red, fragile, deadly. The East India Company sold that opium to smugglers who carried it to China.
The Chinese, in turn, paid for it with silver. And that silver, the same silver, flowed straight back into British pockets to buy tea and sugar for London's breakfast tables. Elegant, profitable, and absolutely poisonous. It was genius, and it was evil. But here's the twist that most history books skip. This wasn't a side hustle of empire, it was the empire. Every transaction, every trade route, every civilized afternoon tea in London depended on a drug deal happening thousands of miles away. Think about that next time you stir your drink. Because while the ladies and gentlemen of Victorian England were gossiping over scones and sugar bowls, somewhere in Bengal, a farmer was scraping resin from a poppy pod, his debt to the company already larger than his next harvest. He didn't know his crop would sail halfway across the world to hook another man's son in Canton. He just knew he couldn't stop growing it. And that's where the real sickness began, not in the smoke dens of China, but in the books of accountants. The East India Company called it balancing trade. They framed addiction as efficiency. They saw profit, not people. It worked. Too well. By the 1830s, China was drowning in opium, while Britain's trade deficit had flipped into a surplus. The empire's books looked perfect, its conscience not so much. But you know what's most disturbing? No one in London seemed to care. Parliament debated taxes, merchants toasted their fortunes, and the British public, the same public that prided itself on morality and order, kept buying cheaper sugar, cheaper tea, and a sweeter illusion. Sweet on the tongue, bitter underneath. An empire high on its own righteousness. But that's only the first layer of this story, because what happened next turned moral compromise into open conflict. A global crisis that would expose just how addicted Britain had become, not to drugs, but to profit itself. The cracks began to show where all addictions do. In denial, China, suffocating under the flood of British opium, tried to stop the trade. Emperor Daoguang demanded action. He sent a man named Lin Zexu, a scholar official with unshakable conviction, to Canton with one mission: end the poison. Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, a desperate appeal to reason. He asked, how could a Christian empire preach virtue and yet flood another nation with vice? The Queen never replied. Instead, British merchants screamed about free trade. And when China confiscated and destroyed 20,000 chests of opium, the empire that claimed moral superiority sent gunboats. They didn't call it revenge, they called it business. That was the first Opium War, and here's the quiet part. It wasn't fought over drugs. It was fought over dessert. Because cutting off opium meant cutting off the silver. And without silver, there was no sugar, no tea, no comfort for the empire's morning ritual. Imagine that chain. A London housewife stirs her cup. A Bengal farmer bleeds into his field. A Chinese addict collapses in an alley. 3 lives, 1 economy, and all of it justified by ledgers and trade balance sheets. It worked again. China lost the war. Britain forced open its ports, legalized the trade, and pocketed even more silver. The profits flowed like syrup, thick, sticky, unstoppable. Tea prices dropped, sugar imports soared. The empire's breakfast table was safe again, but safe for whom? For every cup poured in London, hundreds of families in India and China paid in pain. Their names never made it into the newspapers. Only the profits did. Britain called it progress, civilization, commerce. They never called it what it really was. Dependence on consumption, dependence on illusion, dependence on the idea that wealth cleanses guilt. By now, the British economy wasn't just using opium to pay for sugar, it was addicted to the entire cycle. It needed constant trade, constant appetite, constant justification. Even as the moral backlash grew, even as missionaries cried out that souls were being sold for silver, the markets kept spinning. And here's something few people realize. The addiction wasn't only China's, it was Britain's too. Not to smoke, but to profit. They couldn't stop, even when they tried, because stopping meant facing the truth that the empire's moral backbone was built on rot. So what did they do? They doubled down. They rebranded the narrative. The same empire that waged war to protect drug smuggling started preaching temperance at home. They built charities, funded hospitals, and talked about uplifting the colonies. Classic pattern of guilt laundering. Fix the symptom, not the system. And here's the irony. While London lectured the world about morality, it was still using opium profits to fund railways, telegraph lines, and city expansion. The Industrial Revolution, the pride of Britain, was greased with the money of addiction. Pause here for a second. Think of every modern slogan about ethical trade, fair markets, global economy. Sound familiar? That's the echo of the same logic that once justified poisoning a continent for tea. Business is business, they said, and they believed it right up until the conscience of the empire started shaking. But that awakening didn't come from politicians. It came from ordinary people, from soldiers who saw the misery firsthand, from merchants who couldn't ignore the smell of death beneath the perfume of profit, from writers and artists who started whispering that maybe the empire wasn't noble, it was just hungry. And hunger, as history shows, never stops by itself. It grows until it consumes everything. So the empire feasted on trade, on land, on power, until it couldn't tell the difference between moral success and moral decay. The book's still balanced, but the soul was overdrawn. Yet this is not the end. Because what followed after the smoke cleared, what Britain tried to bury under monuments and museums, reveals the deepest irony of all. The same addiction that made the empire rich would one day expose its greatest weakness. And that truth, the uncomfortable one, is waiting just ahead. It started slowly, and like every withdrawal does, the empire that once moved oceans of silver began to choke on its own conscience. Reports from missionaries, letters from sailors, even the quiet admissions of company clerks painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. Britain had turned addiction into policy. Parliament could argue tariffs, merchants could count coins. But there was no escaping the question echoing through the streets of London: was it worth it? Worth the wars? Worth the broken lives? Worth the empire's spotless illusion of virtue, now stained with the very thing it condemned in others? And yet, even as the moral reckoning began, the machine kept spinning, because the empire had built not just an economy, but a culture of dependency. Every cup of tea, every cube of sugar, every porcelain saucer whispered the same message. This is comfort. This is civilization. This is who we are. But civilization, as it turned out, was fragile. The opium fields of India began to shrink. China's resistance grew fiercer. New powers, America, France, Germany, entered the game with cleaner hands and newer tools. The British monopoly started to fade, and with it the illusion of endless control. And here's where the story flips. Because the same addiction Britain exported across oceans, dependency on pleasure, on comfort, on consumption, came back home. Factories multiplied, workers demanded more sugar, more tea, more goods. The empire had trained its people to crave, to consume, to never stop wanting. It wasn't just the colonies that were hooked anymore, it was everyone. By the end of the century, Britain had achieved something extraordinary, and terrifying. It had taught the world how to sell desire itself. It no longer needed ships of opium to keep the economy alive. Now it had advertising, fashion, and mass production. The drug had changed shape, but not purpose. It wasn't smoked anymore. It was sold, as in department stores, newspapers, and bright promises of a better life. And if you think that ended with the empire, look closer. Every product you buy today, every convenience you can't live without, carries the same pattern. A hidden cost, a dependency disguised as progress. Someone, somewhere, still pays the price for your comfort. Only now the distance is greater and the accounting cleaner, but let's bring it back to that teacup on a London morning in 1850. Steam rising, sugar melting, silver clinking in the spoon. A woman takes a sip, sighs with contentment, and begins her day. She has no idea that her comfort is balanced by suffering across continents. No idea that the sweetness she enjoys was funded by addiction and enforced by war. She doesn't see the opium fields. She doesn't hear the coughing of men in Canton. She only tastes the empire distilled into something warm, fragrant, and deceptively innocent. That's the secret every empire hides, the comfort of a few, built on the silence of many. And the silence only lasts until someone dares to tell the story. So what's left of that story today? The plantations are gone. The company dissolved. The empire officially is history. But its habits, they're still here, still in the global market, still in the way we chase profit, no matter the cost, still in the way we justify our luxuries with the words, "That's just business." Because addiction doesn't vanish, it evolves. It hides behind new names, new technologies, new currencies. And like any addict, the empire learned to pretend it was in control, right up until it wasn't. So next time you stir sugar into your tea, pause. Think of the journey that sweetness took. Think of the hands that paid for it, in poppies, in pain, in silence. Because history isn't gone, it's just dissolved one spoonful at a time. And if you've made it this far, you already sense the deeper truth. This story wasn't about opium or sugar or even Britain. It was about us, about what we choose not to see when something feels good, tastes good, or profits us. But this is only one secret of the empire. In the next story, we'll uncover another everyday luxury that turned into a weapon. Something so ordinary you probably used it this week without realizing it was once a tool of rebellion. So don't look away now. The next chapter of history's hidden economy is already on your table.